You hear some people on your block gossiping about the new neighbor, saying nasty things that they heard about her. What do? Do you stand by and do nothing? Let them keep saying those bad things? Or do you stand up for the person who is the subject of the neighborhood gossip, not worrying how it makes you appear to the gossipers? The first chapter of this week's Torah portion, Parashat Shemot, which is also the first parsha of the second book of the Torah, Exodus, Shemot, teaches us some valuable lessons about doing the right thing. When we see cruelty, when we hear cruelty, we need to do more than be just a so-called innocent bystander. In Parashat Shemot, the Pharaoh of Egypt subjects the Hebrew people to degrading, exhausting, and backbreaking slave labor. But as the Torah tells us in Exodus Perek Aleph Pasuk Yud Bet, Exodus 1 verse 12, V'cha'asher ya'anu oto ken yirbeh v'chen yifrotz. The more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out. Since Pharaoh's scheme to reduce the Israelite population through state-imposed enslavement does not yield the expected results, the king resorts to more drastic measures. In order to achieve the immediate and certain regulation of the population, what does Pharaoh do? He decrees that all newborn Israelite baby boys be murdered. And Pharaoh places the obligation to commit these acts of infanticide upon the midwives, whose names were Shifrah and Puah. But these midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live, as the Torah says in Shemot Perek Aleph Pasuk Yud Zayin, Exodus 1 verse 17, V'tir'ena hamiyaldot et ha'elohim, v'lo asu ka'asher diber aleiha melech Mitzrayim, v'tchayena et hayeladim. They kept the boys alive. It's absolutely remarkable that the names of these two women are recorded in the Torah, especially when we contrast this to the absence of names of the other key players in Exodus chapter 1, including the king himself. After all, the word Pharaoh, Paro in Hebrew, it's not a proper noun. It's just a generic name for the Egyptian monarch. By cloaking the Pharaoh in anonymity while providing names and identities to the midwives, the Torah is expressing a set of values. What the Torah is essentially saying is that the outward magnificence of the king's palace, the dazzling splendor of his court and his colossal pyramids and other monuments, they're all ephemeral, illusory, fleeting, and downright insignificant, implying that Pharaoh's empire will ultimately crumble. It will crumble into dust because it rests on foundations that are empty, void of moral content. Not only are the midwives' names recorded in the Torah, while Pharaoh's name isn't, but also the very word midwives, miyaldot in Hebrew, is repeated 7 times in verses 15 through 21 of this first perek, this first chapter of Parashat Shemot. It's a literary device that indicates the Torah considers the actions of these two women to be extremely important. The Torah is teaching us that these women's defiance, their standing up to tyranny, their upholding of ethical principles, all of these things, and they themselves are worth remembering and emulating. The story of Shifrah and Puah emerges as the first recorded case of civil disobedience in defense of a moral cause. And I think it's important to note that the midwives' disobedience was in fact civil, not violent, unlike this week's insurrection of the Capitol, which was extremely violent. In fact, the midwives' actions were the very opposite of violent. Not only did they not endanger other people's lives, they actually saved lives. I think it's also important to note that the motivation of these two brave midwives in defying Pharaoh's decree is described in Parashat Shemot as a fear of God. The Torah tells us, Vatir'ena hamiyaldot et Elohim. They feared God. They were God-fearing women. Now, this phrase, the idea of fearing God or being in awe of God, is frequently used throughout the Torah in relation to situations that involve moral or ethical norms. So, for example, in Parshat Kedoshim, in Leviticus, Vayikra chapter 19, we're commanded not to insult the deaf, not to place a stumbling block before the blind, out of fear of God. Lo tekalel cheresh v'lifnei iver lo titen michshol v'yareta me'elohecha. And similarly, in the same parsha and in the same parak, the same chapter, chapter 19, the Torah commands us to stand up for elderly people and to show them respect, also out of fear of God. Mipnei seva takum v'hadarta pnei zaken v'yareta me'elohecha. You shall fear your God. So in Parashat Shemot, the God-fearing midwives, when faced with a conflict between obedience to the king's depraved, immoral law and allegiance to a higher ethical standard of God, they chose in favor of God's law, ethical behavior. Even though Shifrah and Puah risked great danger to themselves, they did the right thing. The same can be said of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we celebrate this month. The same can also be said about a lesser-known upstander named Fritz de Zwerver. Fritz the Wanderer, a man who used to go from church to church in Holland on his bicycle, speaking out against the Nazis both before and during the Holocaust. One Sunday morning in 1941, in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands, Fritz arrived in the town of Eibergen, and he walked to the podium of a church, a Calvinist church. And even though there were pro-Nazi Dutch officials sitting in the very front pews of this church, Fritz opened up his Bible to the book of Exodus, chapter 1, and he read out loud the story of Shifrah and Puah, the midwives in Egypt who saved the Hebrew baby boys. Then Fritz said to the congregation, "Who is the Pharaoh today? The Nazis. Who are the babies who have to be saved? The Jews. Who are today's midwives? We are. It is our job to outsmart the pharaohs, to have the courage of the midwives, and to protect the Jews and all of those being persecuted by the Nazis." Then Fritz got on his bicycle and went to the next village. Fritz inspired many people. In fact, many members of these Dutch churches who heard his words organized and participated in an underground movement, hiding Jews in their homes throughout the Holocaust. Even though they risked great danger to themselves, just as Fritz had, and just as the midwives had in biblical times, these Dutch people did the right thing. If this idea can apply to Shifrah and Puah, Fritz de Zwerver, and the righteous Gentiles of Holland, it can be applied all the more so to the situations that most of us are likely to face in our lifetimes. When one person observes another being bullied or slandered or pushed around, when one overhears slanderous gossip about a neighbor, in most of these situations, their lives, our lives, are not generally put at risk for standing up for what is right. We might risk the neighbor or the bully or the other person that we're standing up to. We might risk them thinking less of us. But so what? Even if you risk embarrassing yourself, even if you risk being socially ostracized by mean people, it is never wrong to do the right thing. The path to go from being a bystander to being an upstander may not be easy, but it will always be right. Bystanders are invisible, but like Shifrah and Puah, whose brave act of civil disobedience enabled Moshe to live and thrive, upstanders, like you and I, can change the world for the better. Ken Yehi Ratzon. Shabbat Shalom.